She may have been sorry, but she definitely didn't love her husband. The cane clanged as it touched the floor. Heavy, slow steps were heard. The man, leaning on his wand, climbed up the steps. A young blonde was waiting for him ahead. The brunette had a distraught look. He asked if it seemed even more terrible up close. The Count abruptly grabbed his wife's hand. She screamed in fear and pain but still tried to resist. The brunette clarified whether it was because his wife cheated on him, and he asked if the reason was that the Baron turned out to be so good-looking. The man assumed that the snake promised the blonde eternal love, but the lady shouted that her husband was free to think what he wanted. The brunette assured that he would not act like a girl. She would still remain his wife. The girl answered him with tears in her eyes. He really thought he had the right to call himself her husband. The man never addressed her as his wife. From such audacity, his eyes lit up with a furious fire. He clearly decided that this marriage was over. He still wondered if she really loved the Count. He squeezed her hand so hard that Miss screamed. Despite the fact that the Count treated her badly, he did not want to let her go under any circumstances. And even if the young lady dies, she will not leave him. Even if this damn estate falls apart. The gentleman jerked her hand sharply. She didn't understand why. And why did he treat her like that? Finally, the girl pulled her hand away. The blonde refused to stay here. I didn't want to live in captivity like a ghost. Moreover, her fictitious husband had no right to keep her here. She tried to escape, but nothing came of it. A loud sound was heard. There was a shot from the Count's side. The last thing she said before her death was the answer to the question of whether she loved the Baron. In captivity with him, Madeline could not afford such luxury. This was revenge, not love. Revenge on this man, who kept her locked up until she withered away. The lifeless body fell to the floor. Scarlet blood spread across the stone. Everything around this body was red. She didn't die right away. The blonde still managed to see something then. In the end, she came to terms with her death. Her death should have ended everything. Having endured all this hell for 6 years, Miss remained only a disgraced, unfaithful wife. The last thing the lady saw before she finally died was how the Count sobbed desperately, falling to the floor. The girl was completely satisfied with the expression on her husband's face, distorted by despair and pain. Ian howled throughout the room. If the fact that she was dying made a man feel pain even for a second, then that was enough for her. If hell awaited the young lady, living or dead, she was ready to come to Hades, where at least in his domain she would be free from her husband. But when my lady opened her eyes, what she saw was not heaven or hell at all, and the Roanfield estate. At that moment, when she was only 17 years old, the maid was combing the young lady's long hair. Afterwards, she asked if the mistress felt better. Not quite understanding what was going on, the girl asked again. The assistant explained that she had been unwell in recent days, and everyone was afraid that the disease was serious. Remembering the events from her past life, our heroine mentally assumed that for the last 3 days she had been acting like crazy. She cried, then laughed, then cried again. The lady replied that she was already fine. The worried maid again asked what was bothering her. After all, the girl had never read newspapers before. Without looking up from the black and white lines, my lady answered that she was definitely fine. It was 1914. This was the period when all her life's failures began. When my mother died, she and her father lived relatively happily, but it didn't last very long. Dad was obsessed with the luxurious aristocratic life, and the girl in turn was only interested in beautiful dresses. She didn't care what was happening in the world. But naturally, they could not keep up with the times. It all started the night they lost their entire fortune due to a failed business venture. Then the wind blew in the room from the open window. A creaking sound was heard. When the blonde opened the door, she saw that her father was already dead. The blonde man hanged himself in his office, and the wind scattered all the papers around the room. But before committing suicide, the man wrote a will, and there was not a word in it about his daughter. A young girl without a dowry could only be saved by marriage. That's why she married the Earl of Nottingham, despite the fact that I have never seen him in person. But even such an opportunity was very profitable and wonderful for a young lady in her position. And in the beginning, everything still held up. But the war greatly traumatized her husband. However, over time, they quietly dragged each other into the abyss of despair, from which they never emerged. Ultimately, the marriage ended in great tragedy. But now she was calmly walking around the garden. Digging into her thoughts, she thought that if she was 17 again, they would soon lose their fortune. So it was better. The lady wanted to dissuade her father and change the future. But her stupid dad was on a big tour now, when they needed to watch their expenses. She was still surprised that the man made absolutely no mention of her in that will. Her pupils shrank from fear. A voice was heard behind her calling her name. The lady saw her, then still alive, father in the carriage window. Smiling, the man asked if his daughter had come out to meet him. But without waiting for an answer, he said that it was nice of Miss. Afterwards, the father invited the girl to also get into the carriage. She would be lying if she said that she had never been offended by a man for leaving her so easily. But part of her still missed him. After all, she grew up without needing anything, and everything was thanks to my father. And now she was given a second chance and could not miss it. Milady needed to find a way to survive in these turbulent times. She slowly climbed into the carriage. Her goal was to avoid meeting and getting to know the Earl of Nottingham. The elderly man was not alone in the carriage. He did not immediately introduce his companion to his daughter. The girl's blue eyes widened in horror. She recognized his silhouette, his gaze, and everything else. The man's piercing bright green eyes turned from the window to the entering lady. It was Mr. Nottingham. The charming man shocked Miss. He was dressed in a formal suit with a green tie, which further emphasized the color of his eyes. They all rode together in a carriage towards the castle. The question was asked whether the Count had finished all his business. The father smiled, and he hoped that with his invitation he had not pulled the man out of his busy schedule. The brunette looked out the window indifferently. Hearing the answer from the young man that everything was fine, he was happy. A tense Madeline glanced at her ex-husband. In her previous life, he was in London at this time. Because of this, they never saw each other. The young lady's father heard that one of the gentleman's investments turned out to be very successful, and praised his incredible business acumen. Miss didn't believe it. This man and her husband from a past life were completely different personalities. The Count would break glasses and destroy everything if she did something wrong, and it was like this all the time. When he said not to touch him, and my lady disobeyed, then the husband broke the dishes that the girl had brought on the floor. Then the blonde, flushed and on the verge of hysteria, stammered and tried to justify herself. Something knocked. The gentleman fell sharply to the floor. The servants quickly ran up to him. One of them ordered to call an ambulance, and now, looking at Ian Nottingham, she saw nothing in him similar to the terrible Earl she last remembered him as. The guy sitting opposite was very calm, and he had nothing in common with that evil brunette from Madeline's memories. The Count's piercing blue eyes turned to the girl. He noticed that she was looking at him closely. This confused the young lady. The blonde looked away. Her father was in no hurry to end the dialogue. Since he had previously heard that the gentleman loved horse riding, he decided to ask again and make sure that this was not just an idle rumor. Dispelling all the interlocutor's doubts on this matter, the Count confirmed this. He insisted that lately he had been particularly attracted to horse racing. The girl looked out the window. Her cheeks turned slightly red. She was thinking about her past life. This man did not suffer from a limp, nor did he raise his voice to her. He simply couldn't be the same person. In a past life, she was sitting in a white wedding dress. She was holding a scarlet bouquet of roses in her hands. A veil was put on her head. A gray-haired male servant was holding a tray in his hands, and I asked Miss if she was worried. Hearing a positive answer, he assured that His Excellency was a good man, and therefore he assured that the lady need not worry. She was not afraid of the guy himself. I was just worried whether I could become a worthy wife myself. The blonde didn't exactly hate Ian. Even though there was no love in their marriage, she wanted them to have a good marriage. It was already dark. The candles were burning. The girl swore an oath to be a beacon to such a man, help in recovery, and also become a wise and worthy wife. But on her wedding night, her dreams turned to dust. Ian Nottingham never opened the door to their bedroom, and his wife waited all night. But he didn't come even after a few days. Only once, while walking along the corridor, they accidentally collided. But Madeline didn't even have time to say anything before his silhouette had already disappeared. Cutlery clinked. Food lay neatly on the plates. The sun's rays were falling from the windows. In this dimly lit room, the girl ate alone. The husband did not want to spend a minute of his life with her. An elderly woman, one of the servants, placed a bowl of food in front of her. The lady didn't say a word. The dishes clinked barely audibly. Carefully, according to all the rules of etiquette, the girl devoured the food. One day she walked into her husband's office. She's tired of this attitude. It seemed to her that the Count had simply forgotten about her existence. The brunette sat calmly and leafed through stacks of papers. Then he answered her that this was not so at all. For some time she simply listened to the rustle of documents. There was only melancholy in her blue piercing eyes. Then finally, before leaving, she spoke. She was bored. But the man did not want to spend time with his wife. Therefore, after some time, a gift arrived for her. A small cream-colored puppy sat trembling on the floor. Before this, Miss was reading a book. She turned to the man who had entered. He bowed his head and held a red leash in his other hand. Seeing this gift, Madeline decided to stand up. Quite quickly, she closed the book. There was a bang. The blonde was wearing a blue dress. With sad eyes, she examined the dog. It was clear that this gift was given so that the lady would not get bored. The girl extended her hand to him. Wary, the puppy began to sniff her carefully. Trusting her a little, he carefully licked his finger. Surprise reflected in the lady's piercing eyes. The touched girl completely sank onto the carpet lying on the floor. She hugged the little one tightly to her. Madeline saw some similarities between herself and this dog. Buried in her memories, she did not notice how they arrived. And she shuddered when she heard the voice. When she came out, she watched her dad's actions. He vividly talked about their estate. It was built in the revival style. In their part of the country, few people built like this back then. An elderly man, one of the servants, met the master. He asked how the trip went. He just waved it off and ordered the best tea and cookies to be prepared for the special guest. Smiling at his daughter, he found out if the lady would like to show Mr. Nottingham the estate while the table was being set. Quickly changing the subject, Madeline said she wasn't feeling well. Without leaving her behind, her father continued. The girl glanced furtively at the guy. He suggested that his daughter play something on the piano while they drink tea. The young master noticed the gaze. Miss politely apologized. She would like to lie down. The gentleman in the hat did not stop. He wanted to offer something else. But Ian stopped him with a gesture and said he didn't mind. He bowed a little as he saw the lady off and said that he was glad to meet you. The Count was waiting for an answer from herself. Without much remorse, she also put her hand to her chest. And she apologized for having to leave them. Until she left, she looked at Ian Nottingham. He was still so bright right in front of her. Those piercing green eyes and his dark hair. And so far the soul has not been broken by misfortune. He was talking to one of the servants. When the thought flashed through Madeline's mind, she thought that maybe she shouldn't have interfered in the Count's life. The girl just wanted to try to make sure nothing happened, so that all bad things would pass them by. And besides, closing her eyes, Miss thought, had she not endured enough in all the years? As Madeline left for the last time, she looked at the Count. Their path together had no future, so it was better for them not to get close anymore. The lady turned around and walked towards her chambers. Her blonde hair fluttered in the wind. It was better for the two of them that this short meeting be their last. Milady thought that she would be able to avoid the mistakes of her past life. The blonde was holding a document in her hand. She believed that before the start of the war it was necessary to sell the estate and land. The girl thought that if she kept track of expenses and moved to the village, then she and her father could hold out. Our heroine understood that if she did not force her father to stop gambling and throwing money away, they would definitely end up on the street. Madeline sat and wondered what she should do. But then they knocked on her door. It was her father. He looked in and asked permission to enter. The daughter was delighted to see him. She assured him, smiling, that she just wanted to visit him. Her father handed Madeline an envelope, and he claimed that it was an invitation from London for her. The man sipped his tea, smiling. He assured his daughter that it was just time for her to make her debut in high society. Our heroine thought that now was not the time for balls and social events. She asked if she had to debut. The father looked up at the girl in shock. He asked if his daughter was unhappy now. Miss apologized because she didn't quite understand it. But my lady spent all day reading books and lectures to him so that he would spend less money. And now she didn't want to get married. While drinking tea, the young lady objected that she didn't say that. Refusing to enter high society was the same as refusing marriage for a father. And he has already bought them a townhouse in London. The elderly man really wanted them to stay there in the future. The lady placed the cup on the saucer with a crash, and she said the following: "My father had to sell this house." This infuriated the man, and he shouted, asking Madeline not to talk nonsense. The pupils of his light eyes shrank when the girl ordered him to forget about investing in the wine business. The Count did not understand how she found out about this, and he had a guess. The father jumped up abruptly and asked if Madeline had read his letters. Without waiting for an answer, he said that it was very mean and low. As he was leaving, the enraged blonde ordered his daughter to stay away from the business. In his opinion, Such things were beyond the mind of the young lady. Milady lowered her blue eyes. Taking the invitation in her hands, the girl said that if he continues to do this, then she will not even look towards secular society. The envelope with the stamp flew onto the table. There was a rustling sound. Madeline assured that in this case she would certainly not get married. The gentleman was confused. The blonde smiled. The daughter assured that if the man was stubborn, she would become a nun without a twinge of conscience. The old man was shaking with anger. He stood up, and he yelled at his daughter that he had had enough. Madeline Rowanfield was forbidden to leave the room until she apologized to her father. Beautiful Whitehall. This was already in London. Miss asked if her dad really burned all the contracts. The blonde was worried, and he confirmed that everything was correct. Madeline asked about copies of documents. The father assured that there were none. The elderly gentleman wanted his daughter to dance with someone. After all, she had already refused 6 young men. The young woman especially lowered her eyes. In her lowered hand was a folded fan. She wasn't sure yet. The disappointed father looked at her angrily. Since she was the daughter of the Rowanfield family, she was obliged to marry successfully and support their family. He turned around and moved away from his daughter. And he was full of misunderstanding towards her. His feet touched the floor, making shuffling sounds. Madeline could have argued with her father for a long time. But the girl knew that this season of social events would still be interrupted by the war. The blonde, in turn, did not want to play the role of a beautiful doll again. This time she wanted to choose her own destiny. Green Eyes watched the action. If he can keep them from collapsing, he will find the right path. Thoughts were spinning in my head. Perhaps she would have continued playing the piano. In her previous life, Madeline had heard that after the war, women could work too. Our heroine assumed that everything would turn out well, and in the future she would also be able to find a job. A tall, stately man approached the lady. He had a glass of red drink in his hand. He noticed that the holidays did not seem to appeal to Miss at all. The lady was amazed. Ian Nottingham stood in front of her. Miss Rowanfield was tense because of the young man's company. Madeline should have avoided him. In turn, the Count heard a question. Did not all this action seem strange to him? The slightly surprised brunette answered negatively. All he saw was that people were having fun from the heart. The annoyed young lady looked somewhere deep into the people. It irritated her to watch people having fun. After all, they had absolutely no idea what awaited them in the near future. An elegant male hand reached out to the tray for a drink. They did not know what the future had in store for them and did not even dare to guess. Therefore, we had to enjoy the present while we had the opportunity. This was the Count's opinion. He wanted Milady to relax a little. Moreover, giving up joy in the present tense would not prevent tomorrow from coming. Green Eyes stared anxiously at the man. Pictures from a past life surfaced in the worried lady's memory. Turning her head, Madeline told the Count that she was already relaxed. The brunette looked at her questioningly. The girl simply thought that such meaningless celebrations were just a waste of time. Or rather, there was no value in all this. And the blonde was not eager to make people stop dancing. She just didn't want to do it herself. The corners of the Count's lips lifted in a slight smile. With hope, he asked her if the young lady would dance with him. The blonde thought about it hesitantly. The stately man leaned closer to her. Putting his hand to his chest, he asked if Madeline Rowanfield would give him this dance. The pupils of the light eyes shrank from tension. The girl was not obliged to save anyone. I don't have to save Ian either. Miss heard her heart beating. She always felt strongly that she should take a second chance and avoid this person completely. Now, however, Madeline hesitated. A slightly dark hand reached out to her, inviting her to dance. But if nothing changes, the man will go to war. And terrible things will happen to him there. War will cripple not only his body but also his soul. So a little push in the right direction shouldn't have hurt. Especially if he changes Ian's life even a little for the better. And the girl was going to give him a little advice. The young brown-haired man pointed his cigar at some girl. He counted how many men this lady had already blown off. This was Miss Rowanfield. And while they were sitting here, the beautiful blonde managed to refuse 6 men. She just came out into the world. So apparently she wasn't too desperate yet. Although she didn't look exactly of marriageable age. Finally, the brunette remembered her. A fragment came to mind when she said that she was not feeling well. This was the daughter of Baron Rowanfield. Not noticing them, she thoughtfully looked at one point, putting her fan to her chin. This situation seemed funny to the Count. 2 other guys were arguing about whether to approach her. One believed that it was impolite to approach someone he did not know before, but they were not in the Victorian era. and it was improper to converse with a lady in their day. The brown-eyed brunette was already wondering how he would approach her. But suddenly someone's hand stopped him mid-sentence. The Earl of Nottingham stood up and walked towards the girl. His two companions were indignant and shouted after him. The brown-haired man held a cigarette in one hand, and at the same time continued talking with the guy. He didn't think he would live to see this day. Until the day when Ian himself decides to approach some girl. The brunette walked and slightly adjusted his tie as he walked. This couple looked perfect. The other young misses had already begun to discuss the fact that this was the couple's fourth dance together. The lady was interested in what kind of girl it was. After all, she was now dancing with Mr. Nottingham himself. The second replied that she only knew that this girl allegedly came from the provinces, and she was also a noblewoman. The black-haired man turned away. Despite the lady, he asked her a question. He wondered if she was okay. At first, she didn't understand what was going on, and the companion noticed that her hands were shaking quite strongly. The lady exhaled sharply, and she looked at him as if she pitied him, but she did not dare voice her thoughts. They looked at each other in silence for some time. Squeezing the gentleman's hand more tightly, Madeline was deciding whether to tell him everything. Or maybe they would be better off if she let go of her hand and never regret it again. Miss in a milky dress danced with her boyfriend. Suddenly she didn't notice and accidentally pushed Lady Roanfield. Quickly drawing attention to this, the brunette pulled the girl towards him, thereby preventing her from falling. Milady was thinking about her own thoughts. If somehow their fates become intertwined again, she may once again go through years of loneliness and an unhappy life. In a previous life, when she was 26 years old, Madeline spent a lot of time in the garden. One day, walking through the garden, she noticed roses. There was no flower on one of the stems. Madeline looked alarmed. She tried to find out who could have done this. Every person on the estate knew how much Miss cared for the garden. A beautiful white dog quickly ran away from its owner. Having guessed, the young lady asked if it was his business. But after talking with him, the girl came to the conclusion that he might have eaten the rose. But I thought that I couldn't bite it off so smoothly. In response to this proposal, she heard a cheerful and joyful bark of an animal. The lady was not very upset, and she continued talking to the dog. At the same time, she hopes that whoever picks the rose will bring him at least a little joy. A strong storm was raging outside. The rain drummed on the roof of the mansion. The lady was screaming her dog's name and was very excited. The servant tried to negotiate with the mistress so that she would go home. But not paying attention to his words, she did not stop searching for the dog. Sebastian said that he would look for the dog himself as soon as the rain stopped, and he wanted to bring the lady home. But Madeline screamed furiously that he would come back if he wanted. The girl, soaked through, did not give up hope that her beloved Corey would still be found. The elderly man said that he could not leave the lady alone in such weather. This only enraged Mrs. Roanfield more, and she yelled at him. Heavy footsteps were heard behind them. Noticing this action, the Earl of Nottingham himself came out onto the street. He ordered his wife to return back to the estate. With tears in her eyes, the blonde still wanted to continue her search. But the husband strictly ordered Madeline to forget about the dog. These words touched the deepest part of her. Green eyes looked at the girl with indifference. The Count believed that the dog was just an animal. Therefore, he could not allow a person to fall ill because of some dog. The blonde didn't understand how her husband could talk like that. After all, he himself gave her this animal. Corey was the only one in this estate who cared at all about the girl. Tears flowed down her cheeks, mixing with the raindrops. The Count's hand squeezed his wife's shoulder tightly. The man repeated his order that the girl should go into the house without unnecessary talking or arguing. Her heart was beating wildly. Someone was calling her name, trying to pull her out of her thoughts. The voice was trying to find out if she was okay. Finally coming to her senses, the lady threw the Count's hand away from her. She nonchalantly insisted that she was fine. Raising the hem of her green dress, she curtsied. When saying goodbye, Madeline assured that she had a pleasant time in his company. Having said goodnight and without really explaining anything, the blonde began to leave. Not understanding what was the matter, the Count tried to call out to her. Smirking, Ian thought about the blonde again. After all, she didn't warm up even after 4 dances. This disappointed him somewhat. Servants brought trays of food into the hall. The table was already bursting with delicacies. The young lady thought that she had acted fairly. It wasn't like she was going to avoid Ian Nottingham for the rest of her life. Moreover, in such a narrow aristocratic circle, this would be quite problematic. But that didn't mean she was looking forward to sitting at the table directly across from him. And my lady especially did not have a burning desire to be part of this whole conversation in a raised voice. But be that as it may, a brunette with short hair shouted at the Count. The guy himself calmly continued to eat, slightly squinting at his furious neighbor. He asked his sister not to indulge in emotions, and he ordered Isabel to lower her voice. The angry girl continued to scream. She heard that this is why she was manipulated by that non-entity. This surprised but did not stop the girl from screaming. What only infuriated her more was that her brother called that man a non-entity. When the main character married Ian in a past life, the Count at that time no longer had living relatives. At that time, his younger brother volunteered for the front line. And in the end, he died in battle. And my sister died in an accident before the start of hostilities. Afterwards, there were rumors that the accident was not accidental. Isabel was with a man from a much less noble family. And unable to overcome the prejudices of society, they decided to end their lives together. In a past life, Miss Roanfield sometimes thought that her husband would not have been so broken if his relatives had remained alive. And after the death of Isabel's sister, the man never touched her things, and he always kept them in their place. It was as if he wanted to have an eternal reminder of bitter regret and melancholy. One day in the past, when the girl was 22, she accidentally walked into the deceased's room. Looking around the room, she noticed the piano. That, like everything in this room, belonged to Isabel. What surprised Miss was that there was not a speck of dust in this room. Apparently, this room has been very well taken care of. The piano and the whole room were clean to perfection. The bed is perfectly made, and the sun's rays leaked into the room from the windows. Judging by the well-kept appearance of the room, the blonde came to the conclusion that Ian loved his late sister very much. Some paper rustled and fell to the floor. As it turned out, it was a photograph of a beautiful couple. Madeline picked it up and began to examine it. A man and a woman stood next to each other. The lady guessed that the woman was Isabel, but she couldn't understand who was standing next to her. The caption at the bottom said the photo was for his beloved Zachary Myloff. Above the piano keys was a music stand. The lady realized that this picture had fallen from there. Madeline carefully returned it to its place. At this moment, she couldn't help but pay attention to the musical notations. After all, they were all written by hand. Miss Isabel wrote this song especially for her lover. They said he was a socialist. But the girl herself did not particularly understand politics. She did not find the girl alive, so it was very interesting what she was like during life. A sophisticated lady who loved to play the piano, or a woman in whom life and morality were in full swing so much that she was ready to die for love. Milady came to the idea that, whatever person Isabel might be, the sound of her piano when she walked the earth would certainly have enveloped even this gloomy estate in a sunny and pleasant embrace. Madeline sat down at the piano. The girl really wanted to play on it. Soon she touched the keys and the music flowed through the room in harmonious chords. She thought that if Isabel were still alive, Ian might be completely different. But before she could finish her thought, the door swung open. The Count's face was hidden in the shadows, but it was noticeable that the man was angry. Before he could understand what had happened, he ordered his wife to get out of here. This tone made her feel uncomfortable, and turning to her husband, she asked him to explain to her why. To which, raising his wild eyes, Ian replied that she should never dare to enter this room again. But now Isabel was still alive, and then, based on his reaction, she assumed that the Count was strongly attached to his family. However, now they were literally ready to grab each other's throats. The brunette stood up sharply and screamed. Raising the hem of her dress, Isabel shouted that her brother himself was a non-entity. Grabbing her hat from the table, the brunette quickly walked towards the exit of the room. Ian ordered her to sit down, to which he received a rather harsh response. She assured that her brother's company deprived her of air. Isabel no longer wanted to live in such a place. The blonde's heart was pounding. The brown-haired man who was sitting next to my lady was telling her something. Without listening to the end, she got up from the table and excused herself. Alarmed Madeline, picking up the hem of her dress, hurried after the Count's sister. The guy sitting next to her tried to call out to her, and the future husband just turned around and looked after her. Almost stumbling, the blonde ran down the stairs. She was afraid that she wouldn't make it in time, but Lady Isabel was still standing below. That's why our heroine called her. The blonde ran up and grabbed the lady's hand. The girl did not understand what happened, so she simply apologized and said that she had to go. But Madeline insistently asked her to stay. Knowing what followed next, she asked the brunette a question. Was it true that she was going to her lover? This made Isabel shudder slightly. The brunette thought that this lady had been eavesdropping on their conversation all this time, but Miss Renfield denied all this. Pulling her hand away, the brunette continued her monologue. She didn't believe Madine and was sure that she had overheard. And she said that all sorts of impudent women hovered around her brother. Looking back at the stranger with contempt, she was surprised. Did the girl really think that in this way she could attract the attention of the young count? With the last of her strength, the blonde asked after the departing lady. Did she go to Mr. Myloff now? A little frightened by this, Isabel stopped and turned to face the stranger. She couldn't understand how the young lady knew this. Madeline assured that she would not tell anyone about this, and she insisted that she knew nothing about socialism or whatever it was called. Suspecting something was wrong, Isabel made one last attempt and asked if the girl was an informant for her brother. But this was not the case at all. After all, according to the blonde, Mr. Nottingham was a well-bred gentleman. But he was not without the flaw of stubbornness. Quickly warming up to the girl, the brunette herself said that she would not call him a gentleman, and she herself was sure that her brother knew how to crush people under himself. Looking sideways at her new acquaintance, Isabel said that she knew him too well, but Miss was simply taught by experience. Grabbing the brunette's hand again, Madeline began to speak quickly. She didn't have to give in to his stubbornness and desire to control everything and everyone. Remembering her past life, the blonde said that she once broke her pride for the sake of a man, and with this she ruined her whole life. In the end, I even went down a road that had no return, just to vent all my anger. As she squeezed Isabel's hand, she wasn't worried about getting involved with the brunette again. She only wanted to save the girl standing in front of her, a girl who was also blinded by rage and who faced a sad fate. After all, Isabel was so similar to herself. Without stopping, Madeline continued. She insisted that it might seem like there was no other way out, but that was not true. Smiling and taking both her hands, our heroine assured that there were still many paths in the world that Isabel had not yet tried. Finally giving in, Miss agreed with her new friend, and now she asked to let go of her hand. Heavy footsteps were heard behind them. Hearing this, the two of them turned to look at the man descending. It was the Earl of Nottingham. Noticing Madeline holding his sister's hand, he was surprised. Before reaching the end of the stairs, the Count began his monologue, that this matter was between him and his relative, and he asked the blonde to leave them. Quickly asking her name, Isabel refused it. Holding her back so she wouldn't leave, she stood a little further away. The blonde was perplexed. Saying her name, Isabel shouted to her brother that she would stay with her. Period. Noticing that his sister was pestering the lady whom he had just met, the Count received a strong rebuff. In response, I heard that they were communicating, and please do not poke your nose into their conversations. The tense blonde asked Miss to let go of her hand, but she insisted that she was the first to grab her. Turning around, Ian told his sister that her sister should not forget that every action leads to consequences, and he turned to Miss Roanfield as he was leaving. He didn't know how she knew his sister, but he believed that interfering with other people's families was not the most reasonable behavior. Without saying anything else, he quickly walked up the stairs. Sighing heavily, the still angry girl was perplexed. She wondered who Ian even thought he was. After all, he behaved as if he were her father. Closing her eyes, the blonde was not the least bit disappointed. She knew that he wouldn't even bother to say a word of gratitude for the fact that she calmed his sister down. Already in her chambers, looking at the latest newspapers, Madeline was able to calmly exhale. After all, in the past, newspapers only wrote about Isabel's death, but today they wrote about something completely different. So the girl was clearly safe and healthy. Apparently, in her previous life, there was no one to stop Isabel, since this fight was their last interaction with their brother. Well, now Madeline understood. And soon after that incident with Isabel's piano, her husband gave her her own piano. Maybe this action was an apology to her, but now it was no longer so important. What was more important was that the next social evening was to take place at the Colcat country estate. Sometime later, at the country estate of the Colcat family, our heroine hesitantly looked around. Looking around the entire room, the blonde came to the conclusion that Ian didn't come today for some reason. This meant that she could make new acquaintances today. But at that moment, a man had already extended his hand to the lady. Smiling, the guy politely greeted the lady, and he insistently invited me to go with him. Accepting his invitation, Madeline placed her hand on his. At that moment, the blonde wasn't really thinking about anything. Seducing her partner spoke to her, about the fact that it was worth arranging this evening if only for the chance to accompany Miss Roanfield. Even in her past, he left many girls in tears after this, seducing them with such compliments. Without stopping, the gentleman told Madeline that they were just drinking tea before dinner, and asked if the lady was hungry. But I received a negative answer. He was also interested in whether Miss Roanfield had been to Vienna. After all, it was an incredibly modern and developed city, and I thought that she would really like it there. The days in Vienna made him think that humanity would soon experience endless progress. Completely agreeing with him, my lady thought about her own things all the time. Unfortunately for her, the war will soon raze this city to the ground. George handed her a glass of alcohol, but since the girl had not yet managed to reach it, someone's male hand took it away. He didn't quite agree with the brunette's opinion. Raising her eyes in surprise, the blonde saw that it was he who had finally arrived, the Earl of Nottingham. The rest of those present at this celebration discussed the Nottingham family. Apparently, George was in the same class as the Count. Madeline wasn't surprised. She just clenched her hand in a fist. Along with Ian, his younger brother was also here, still alive and cheerful. And of course Isabel. The girl's black hair was tucked behind her ears, and green eyes warily watched their recent acquaintance. Eric was talking to the brown-haired man. He was not sure that humanity would continue to progress peacefully. Intruding into the conversation, Ian continued. In his opinion, people were selfish creatures. It was their nature to compete with each other. And no matter how ironic it may be, it was precisely thanks to this that they were able to achieve progress. The guy clarified whether he meant that development now depended on military forces. But reforms have always gone hand in hand with violence. But Eric stopped him. And he wondered if he really thought that wars were possible in their age. After all, the world has never been as economically united as it is now. Politely stopping his brother, he said that he did not agree with him, and he believed that if such a need arises, a new armed conflict will definitely occur. All this time, while the Count was conducting a dialogue, the blonde continued to look at him. Noticing this, he turned to her and smiled. Holding a glass of alcohol in his hands, he decided to ask the blonde her opinion. Therefore, I turned directly to Miss Roanfield. He was interested in her thoughts on this matter. Startled, she was a little taken aback. After thinking a little about what to answer her, the girl finally began to speak. Regarding progress, my lady agreed with him. That military power is the key to development. But even if this was so, could he justify millions of lost lives and broken destinies in the name of achieving progress? In her opinion, Mr. Nottingham was correct in his statements. However, wars were started because of people who believed in necessary evil. All the guys listened to her politely. The Count grinned. The blonde's opinion completely satisfied him. Suddenly, all eyes turned to Madeline. The brunette didn't say anything else, so the lady got tense. Losing herself in her thoughts, she wondered if she had been too frank at that moment. Then there was silence in the hall, but Eric still decided to diffuse the situation a little. And leaving the conversation about politics, he changed the topic. So I asked if anyone was going to tennis at Wimbledon this year. And George was surprised and asked if he was still playing. Confirming, he said that Ian played so well that he was even tempted to sign up for the men's doubles. Miss breathed a sigh of relief at the change of topic. The Count asked himself not to praise himself so much, but his brother told him to stop being modest. After all, he would like to somehow get along with him on the court. The guys continued some kind of argument. Tired of this, the blonde decided to clear her head. So I headed towards the exit. The brunette watched her go. Going out onto the balcony and watching the sunset, she thought about today's conversation. Madeline didn't want to express her disagreement with Ian's opinion so openly, but the Count was not very upset by this statement. Therefore, our heroine tried not to think too much about this. And in fact, remembering the way the man looked at her, it seemed that he even liked it. This gave the young lady goosebumps. Looking down at the garden, at first I couldn't even believe my eyes. Meanwhile, Isabel was walking along the path between the trees with her lover. Madeline realized that it was her boyfriend after that photo from her past life surfaced in her memory. Watching them, the girl noticed that they felt very good being around each other. Isabel laughed cheerfully and carefree. Miss Renfield muttered quietly to herself that they looked so in love just now. So much in love that the brunette was even ready to die for him. Madeline also wanted to love like that someday. She stood with her back to the door the whole time. That's why I didn't immediately hear someone come onto the balcony. Turning around, the blonde saw Mr. Nottingham. He asked if he could talk to her. The lady was scared. After all, if the Count came closer, he would definitely notice Isabel. To avoid trouble, Madeline quickly got her bearings. Coming closer to Ian, she looked into his eyes. Because the lady was too close, he blushed slightly and turned away. Explaining the topic of conversation, he said that he would like to talk to her about what happened during their last meeting. The Count realized that he shouldn't have scolded the girl for only lending a helping hand for Isabel. She looked down and noticed the couple again. In response, she quickly muttered that she understood everything. And the fact that he, like a brother, was worried about Isabel. Raising the hem of her dress, Madeline quickly rustled towards the exit. The couple was about to get caught. Therefore, the blonde needed to get the Earl of Nottingham out of here as quickly as possible. Having already passed him and standing in front of the door, she offered to go inside after all. The young man looked at her back. He was discouraged by Miss Roanfield, and he told her so directly. For some time now, she had firmly made it clear to Ian that she had no sympathy for him. Therefore, looking down and thinking, he said that for him it all looked as if Miss despised him. Afterwards, the Count muttered that he didn't know for sure, and perhaps he just imagined it. The guy extended his hand to her. He hoped Madeline's dislike would not get worse. After all, both of them will not benefit from this. Besides, you never know what awaits you in the future. Noticing that the sun was already setting and it was starting to get cold outside, Ian invited the blonde to go inside. Having quoted his words about the future, the girl said that for her it sounded as if only misfortune lay ahead. After speaking without waiting for an answer, the lady bowed in a curtsy. The girl assured the Count that she would still like to admire the landscape, and he could go on his own. Smirking, the man misunderstood this statement a little. In his eyes it looked as if my lady did not want to open up even for a short moment. Respecting her wishes, the brunette decided to leave her alone today. However, he did not want to retreat further. Looking at the determined Ian, the girl's eyes widened. At that moment, she suddenly remembered the couple enjoying each other in the garden. How absurd they seemed in the eyes of these passionate lovers. The Count, who considers obsession with love, must have been incredibly funny to him. This man stood in front of her as if protecting her from the wind, when in fact he was only throwing his shadow at Miss. How then? She definitely came to the conclusion that she could not allow the brunette to give her hope again. In Madeline's past life, when she was 25 years old, she was sitting alone in a spacious room, looking at the floor with sad eyes. She didn't understand how much longer she had to live like this. A beautiful dog lay at her feet. A single tear rolled from her blue eyes. Miss Roanfield did not understand whether she would really have to live like this until her death. Looking sadly at the sleeping dog, she could not imagine what would happen to Corey after her death. The transparent liquid was already dripping from the charming eyes. But the girl was also worried about another question. What would happen to herself when the dog died? After all, if a faithful friend leaves a miss in this outback, she will simply go crazy without him. Miss Roanfield was haunted by dark thoughts. Is she really obliged to exist here until the end of her days, like a ghost? But what if the girl remains imprisoned there even after her own death? If Miss was to spend forever, eternity in this hell, alone? Stopping her gloomy thoughts, Milady abruptly stood up from her seat. Having sat down, the dog looked into the owner's eyes. Afterwards, he whined a little to attract attention. After thinking about something, the blonde turned to her faithful friend. He had nothing to worry about. The next morning, his assistant stood in the Earl of Nottingham's office. The man himself could not believe what his wife had done that night. The elderly man bowed and was very tense about the situation. I addressed His Excellency but did not understand what to say next. The lady herself, taking with her only the dog, left the estate under cover of darkness. It was already midday. The girl was in a central London cinema and she couldn't believe it. Her heart was still pounding from the stress she had experienced. She finally managed to escape from home. With her hands folded in her lap, she thought about the estate and Ian. Milady suspected that there was a commotion in the mansion now. But she was more worried about the condition of her husband. Was the man happy to get rid of her or upset? A very entertaining film, Baby, was playing on the screen. It was a silent recording starring Charlie Chaplin, where a tramp finds an abandoned child and raises him. Watching all this, the blonde was amazed. After all, it wasn't even his own child. And the man did so much for him. There was not a single drop of blood between these two. And despite this, they were one family. Madeline was surprised herself when she realized that tears were quickly running down her cheeks and dripping onto her knees. Finally arriving in the room after watching this film screening, The girl noticed Corey greeting her. She barked and actively wagged her tail. Madeline took the box from the shelf and poured the leftovers into the dog's food. Sitting down next to him, she began to tell him about what a wonderful film it was today. The way people moved on the wall seemed very fascinating to her. Squatting in front of him, the blonde said that it was so wonderful when you were free. Looking sadly at the empty pack of dog food, the young lady was wondering where she could get a new pack. Looking at herself in the mirror, she noticed her wrinkled and already very dirty dress, but did not know where to wash it. After knocking, they turned to her. The man behind the door announced that a telegram had arrived for Madame. The letter flew under the crack at the bottom of the door. She looked at this envelope with eyes full of fear and excitement. Finally deciding, Madeline picked it up and wanted to open it. But not even a whole day has passed since her departure. After reading the contents of this letter, Miss turned pale. He will be waiting for her at the station. Ian Nottingham. Leaning her forehead against the door and not letting go of the sheet of paper, she sadly answered to herself that her thoughts were false. She thought that she had escaped, since she got all the way to London. Clearly having made hasty conclusions, the girl began to think about what she should do next. For some reason, her soul felt lighter after that. Finally, the girl returned from her thoughts to the real world, where she was 17 again. Her head was now occupied by more important issues than dancing and the ball. She wondered if it was really impossible to live comfortably in this world without inheritance or marriage. She also reproached herself for the fact that before her last death she did not remember the names of at least 10 companies where she could have profitably invested. Tiredly looking at one point, Madeline came to the conclusion that she deserved the title of a complete fool more than a noble woman. Distracting Milady from her thoughts, a man approached her. Hearing his presence, she recognized her as Mr. Nottingham. Having greeted Mademoiselle, the brunette said that lately she had looked incredibly tired. Sitting down in a chair next to the blonde, he asked if the London air suited her. Not wanting to sit in silence, the lady agreed with him. The air in London was indeed far from clean. However, the reason for her fatigue was completely different. The girl simply stayed up late studying. Clinging to this, the brunette wondered if she studied ancient Greek or something like that, remembering how she desperately tried to make out the handwriting in her father's ledger. The blonde said that it was closer to ancient Greek tragedies. Deciding to say this out loud, the lady muttered that at the moment she was puzzling over how to avoid an inevitable fate. Such thoughts seemed strange to the man. After all, young noblewomen in those days were little worried about such things. After the Count's question about whether it was Mr. Ronefield, our heroine realized that her father's habit of living in grand style was known even in London. Madeline looked away. The Count apologized for his tactless question, but the interlocutor asked him not to apologize. She really needed to prepare for the worst. The brunette's advice was that it was better for the girl to find a person who would solve this issue for her. In the man's eyes, it looked more practical. She figured that was what most people did. But her situation was radically different. Remembering events from her past life, she came to the conclusion that she would like to live in such a way that she would no longer depend on anyone. Has a man ever hated himself so much that he began to hate other people? This was the girl's question for the Count. His eyebrows shot up. The guy didn't understand why he had to hate himself. Miss was slightly shocked by his answer, but she was not taken aback. She laughed quietly and covered her mouth with her hand. The amazed man watched his interlocutor in bewilderment. Finally calming down, she apologized. It was a little rude of her. Turning her tender blue eyes to the Count, Madeline said that such self-confidence was worthy of admiration. A dark-haired man rushed into the room, abruptly throwing open the doors. In a hurry, he turns to Miss Ronefield. At that moment, Madeline's world collapsed. Something terrible happened. Her father went bankrupt after all. Throwing open the doors of her estate, the girl shouted to the assistant standing next to her with a question about where her father was now. Frightened by such a sharp and nervous tone, the maid stammered and replied that His Excellency was now in the bedroom. Lifting the hem of her dress, the blonde hastily took off up the steps and clarified how long he had been there. As it turned out, the man had not left his room since lunch. He also previously gave the order not to let anyone into his room. Terrible memories from her past life flashed before the lady's eyes. Has it really happened all over again? Clutching her dress in her hands, she rushed into the room to refute her assumptions. Almost crying, the young lady opened the door to her father's room. Because of such sharpness, the door hit the wall. The brown-haired woman running after the lady clarified that the gentleman allowed only the butler to enter his room. Having bowed, the servants left so as not to disturb. With a sharp change in her face and smiling with relief, the lady sat down. The man did not understand why his daughter was so nervous. She had to behave like a lady. Ordering him to forget about it, Madeline interrupted her father. She asked how it happened that they were now bankrupt. After all, Dad assured that he burned all the contracts. Judging by his look, this question clearly took the man by surprise. His nose was red and his eyes were shiny with tears. Taking off his sleeping cap, the blonde buried his face in his knees and sobbed, saying that it was all because of him. Milady had many questions, but he told everything himself. The trading company in which the gentleman invested still went bankrupt, and their entire fortune was invested in it. Taking his daughter's hand in his, the man looked pleadingly into her eyes. Now all hopes were only for her. She probably should have been glad that everyone was alive. In this life it was possible to at least somehow help him. Stroking her father's hand, Madeline assured him that her father need not worry. After all, he was alive, which means that somehow they would solve financial problems together. Her plans were to sell her land and house in London, and then she was going to go to work to pay off the debt. Before his daughter could finish, the man interrupted her. To him it was all nonsense. He believed that nobles should not have to work. Moreover, Mr. Nottingham liked the blonde. Not fully understanding what he was getting at, Madeline said that they had only danced together a few times. But that's exactly what the man was talking about. Previously, Ian did not pay attention to the opposite sex at all, and even if not the Count, there were still a huge number of other men in the world. So the daughter had to stop talking nonsense and start looking for a worthy life partner. Standing in a magnificent blue dress at yet another social evening, our heroine was wondering what she needed to do next. It seems that the father was firmly convinced that Miss was supposed to marry some moneybag. So now the blonde didn't understand how to convince him. If they sold the land, the townhouse, and their estate, they might be able to hold on somehow. But how will they earn a living after the money from these sales runs out? Madeline was firmly convinced that now was not the best time to go to parties. Interrupting her thoughts, a drunk man approached her. It was Mr. Periel. He was extremely pleased to see that the lady enjoyed the party. After such a monologue, he wanted to invite her to dance. However, trying to do this as politely as possible, Miss bowed in a curtsy and muttered that she did not feel very well just now. However, the gentleman did not like this answer at all. Frowning, he said that he had heard about the misfortune that overtook the Roanfield family. However, with such a daughter, her father had nothing to worry about. After all, her 17 years were the prime of her youth. And since the blonde probably has a trail of gentlemen lined up behind her, who are ready to lend a helping hand, he believed that the girl could do without him. They were already not in the best position at the moment, and she shouldn't have been rude to him, so as not to make it worse. Therefore, I tensely thanked him for his advice. Her eyes widened in surprise when a familiar voice was heard behind her. He asked to turn on the music. Looking up, our heroine recognized Mr. Nottingham. Ignoring her, the brunette continued. There was some kind of disgusting squeaking in his ears. Eyes full of rage turned to the brown-haired man. Maybe this squeak was the bleating of a drunken idiot who did not know how to distinguish between wise advice and impudence. Such an onslaught gave Mr. Periel goosebumps. He hurried away, muttering that he would take up music. The guy standing next to him noticed that Ian actually attacked the organizer of this evening. He was clearly not the type to stand silently on the sidelines. The brown-haired man didn't understand since when the Count cared about anything at all. But before he could finish, the girl called out to Miss Roanfield. Grabbing Madeline's hand, the brunette chirped that a new catalog of dresses had just been released. She simply had to go look at the brochure with it. Taking the blonde, Isabel explained to her surprised friend that this is how ladies justify avoiding the topic. Looking back at her dear brother, she noted that he was literally throwing knives at her with his gaze. Lady Isabel has recently been worried about the question of whether her new friend was a medium, and whether she knew how to see the future or talk to the dead. Smiling tensely, Madeline denied everything. Miss continued that she had no idea how mysterious the blonde was. After all, she knew not only the name of her secret lover, but also what she was going to do. Frowning, the blonde clarified whether she really intended to die that day. In rebuff, I received that Isabel only wanted to ride in a car, even though I was a little drunk at the time. With a reproachful look in her eyes, Miss asked if she knew how stupid it would be on her part. I received a stern answer to this. The interlocutor considered her a decent lady, and she did not think much before saying something. In this life, she no longer tried very hard to save face. This phrase reminded Isabel of someone she knew. The brother said the same thing, but the blonde never found out about it, although she was interested in who the friend was. In response, she heard that it was her old friend. Because the girl liked Madeline, she was going to tell her something very important. The brunette heard her brother say that he intended to invite the lady to their home. This was very unpleasant news for my companion. After all, Madeline consoled herself with the thought that a lot had changed in this life, and also that now everything will be completely different. However, a huge wave called fate was getting closer and closer. At the same time, taking you back to the already experienced past. The carriage was driving along the road. The Rowanfield family sat inside. The man yelled at his daughter for disobeying him and not wearing pink. She replied that she had no desire to go dressed in bright colors, intending to ask for financial help. The blonde just sighed heavily. It annoyed him that his daughter was so stubborn. Showing her the letter, her father said that it was not from His Excellency the Earl of Nottingham for him. It was sent by her eldest son for her. The man did not understand why he would be invited by a family whom he had never had the honor of meeting before. The lady already had suspicions of what he was driving at. That's why I got ahead of myself, saying not to place high hopes on it. The Nottinghams were a wealthy and influential family. That is why it is unlikely that anyone could be interested in the daughter of an impoverished baron. Following from this, Miss had great suspicions whether Mr. Nottingham wrote this letter at all. Rolling his eyes, the blonde was infuriated that his daughter Madeline was so angry. He was sure that the master had sent the invitation, even knowing about their situation. Therefore, now it was necessary to win him over in order to receive any possible help. Lost in her thoughts, the girl did not really listen to her father. She was sure that that arrogant man would never propose to her. Surely he was just trying to satisfy some of his moral obligations. When they arrived at the Nottingham estate, the servant bowed and greeted them politely. She recognized the older man as Sebastian. This shocked the blonde. She was so distracted by the count and completely forgot that she could meet other people. Noticing Mrs. excited gaze lingering on him, the man decided to ask what was bothering her. But she responded by saying that everything was fine. Finally, calm footsteps were heard not far away. The Nottingham family just came out to meet them. The older man assured that they were looking forward to the guests. After that, he introduced his wife Catherine, as well as his eldest son. Curtsying politely, the Miss thanked His Excellency for the invitation to the estate. In her past life, she did not have time to meet the Count and his wife. His Excellency was struck down by an illness, which then took his life right before the start of the war. And Lady Nottingham, who survived the death of 2 of her children, slowly faded away from grief, and eventually also passed away to a better world. In the portrait that Madeline had previously seen, the Count seemed to be a very cold and distant person. However, considering his illness, he looked quite happy. It was already sunset outside. Finally seeing what she didn't have time to do in her previous life, her husband's estate, our heroine realized what it was like. Ian extended his hand to her, inviting her to follow him into the house. At first, the blue-eyed girl was a little confused. After hesitating a little, she nevertheless put her hand in his, and thanking him, followed the brunette. Despite all my lady's concerns, the visit to the Nottingham estate passed without incident. Everything here turned out to be completely different from what it was in her previous life. Her father was chatting enthusiastically with the head of the family, and also, to her great surprise, all the people here were full of energy and enjoying life. Having finally discovered for herself how different everything was here, the girl began to see Ian in a completely different light. If before her arrival a huge misfortune had not happened to this family, then it is possible that their past lives would have had a completely different outcome. If she had been on this estate a little earlier, perhaps she and the Earl of Nottingham would have even had a relationship. But Miss did not finish her thoughts. She was interrupted by asking whether she and her father enjoyed the meal with their family. Her father assured that even the tea today was incomparable. Madeline assured that it was difficult to find words to fully express her gratitude. She thought that it was already late, and it was time to bring up the issue of their dire financial situation. Ian's father smiled, saying it was nice to meet you. After which, so as not to disturb the young people, everyone except the eldest son went out. This angered the blonde. The father, with a stern look, clearly ordered his daughter to be a good girl. When the lock on the door clicked, she jumped up in confusion. The brunette sitting opposite told her not to get up, as he was going to get up himself. And after that, without explaining anything, he came closer to her and with a quick movement got down on one knee in front of her. Smiling, he looked into the face of his companion. Without hesitation, he took the box with the ring out of his pocket and asked Miss Roanfield to marry him. Frowning her brows, Milady nervously asked why. The guy, in turn, without allowing her to finish the sentence, interrupted her uncontrollably. He realized that he had taken Miss by surprise. He was honest that news had reached him about Madeline's father's bankruptcy. Turning away and not wanting to listen to this further, the girl clarified how it was all connected. Raising one eyebrow, the Count's face showed bewilderment. He wanted to say that he could only give the girl what she needed now. Ahead of her question, he said that everything had already been decided with the parents, so nothing more would be required from the miss. Taking out that gift box again, the brunette proposed marriage to Madeline. He believed that the young lady noticed the state of her father's health. The Count showed off his engagement jewelry. The designer gold ring with monograms was inlaid with a massive fancy-cut diamond and a scattering of small stones, creating the effect of a shimmering path, emphasizing the beauty of the solitaire. Ian wanted his father to see the wedding before he died. With full confidence that, being in such a deplorable situation, the girl would not refuse, he continued to hold the box with the ring. But suddenly the blonde asked whether the Count loved her. The man was surprised and asked again. The question was repeated. Trying to find the right words to describe his feelings, he rose from his knees to his feet. Looking into Mrs. eyes, Ian began to say that he could not call his feelings towards her something so fleeting. And also what the Count felt for my lady would be more correctly characterized by sympathy and similarity of views. He finally slammed the box shut. According to the young lady, the young Count behaved like a strange philosopher, constantly talking about ideals that were far from the real world. Having apologized in advance for the rudeness that she was about to say, she assured that he seemed to her much more responsible than his parent. The brunette remembered what was mentioned earlier about wanting to live without relying on other people. Ian then made the argument that, if he could think straight, he was the best partner to achieve this goal. His preference was that the lady of his heart be sensible and not naive, like all those young ladies from other houses. Continuing to persuade the girl to accept such a tempting offer, he asked not to miss the chance. The lady was already starting to get tired of this kind of emphasis. Smiling sadly, Madeline stammered that he really was always trying to buy her favor. In protest, Ian shouted that he had never tried. But the miss did not let him finish, calling out his name menacingly. Shaking her head, the girl turned away and began to assure that she had not come here to marry him. Grabbing the hand of the already leaving Madeline, the young Earl of Nottingham did not understand the reason for her refusal. The girl clearly just needed to think, and that was the point. With despair in his eyes, Ian looked into Mrs. eyes. Some suspicions crept into his mind. Turning around and very sharply pulling her hand out, the blonde screamed that she wouldn't even think about it. Moreover, the last thing she wanted was to sell herself to some man because of her own father's debts. Remembering moments from her terrible past life, our heroine was sure that she did not want to repeat those mistakes again. The brunette was perplexed and confused about what mistakes were being discussed. Therefore, he decides to ask what kind of mistakes he made. In his opinion, this proposal was beneficial not only to Ian but also to Miss herself, and he also did not want to offend his interlocutor. Stopping this pressure and attempts to persuade her to marry, Madeline said that there was no way they could be together. But Mr. Nottingham did not want to accept the refusal. Therefore, he also asked to name the reason, since it seemed to him that the young lady considered him a fool. Raising her neat blue eyes to this man, the blonde easily made an argument. In her opinion, they simply destroyed each other. Sighing heavily, the young man covered his face with his hand. Finally admitting defeat, he did not argue further. Nottingham, without saying anything more, turned around and walked towards the doors. The young lady turned away. Heavy footsteps were heard. Then the door slammed. Almost crying, Madeline told herself that she shouldn't have come here after all. The crackle of fire was heard behind. And even though this Ian had not done anything wrong, there was nothing to hope for in their relationship. Memories flashed from a past life when she was 25. She sat on the sofa near the extinguished fire and cried. Sniffling, I thought about my dog Corey. Then it rained all night. What if something happened to the dog? Tears rolled down her cheeks. The pupils shrank in surprise when the mistress heard one of the servants calling out to her. A gray-haired man stood in the doorway, and next to him stood a happy, handsome, and well-groomed dog. The lady was incredibly happy to see her beloved dog alive, and she immediately ran towards him in order to caress him. Looking at how happy they were for each other, the man explained that the gardener had found the dog this morning. Corey was wet, but overall he was fine. With a blush on her cheeks and tears of happiness in her eyes, Madeline looked at the assistant and asked where this same gardener was. Moreover, she had to thank him for such an action. The man exclaimed that he was just doing his job but did not finish the sentence. There was a silent question in the lady's eyes. Closing his eyes and lowering his head, he explained that Mr. Nottingham had come down with a cold. Rising to her feet and looking away from her dog, Madeline asked if her husband had come down with a cold. Then she clarified how bad he was. She was worried about Ian. Recounting the latest events, the servant said that the doctor had prescribed strict bed rest for the gentleman. After this, the argument was followed by a request not to go up to the top floor with him. Walking along the empty corridors in the evening, the girl stood in front of a dark door. Her head was full of thoughts about whether this was really a coincidence and why Ian caught a cold today. The blonde thought to herself that she just needed to make sure that everything was really fine with her husband and that she was safe. Noticing a puddle in the corner under the hanger and hearing drops of water flowing from the jacket, some guesses flashed through her head. Madeline's eyes widened in surprise. She couldn't believe it was all true. And if you put all the facts together, that Ian had a cold, and that water was dripping from his raincoat, then it turned out that the man had been looking for the dog all last evening and night while it was raining. Looking again at the brunette sleeping in his chambers, the girl could not believe it. She was full of confidence that her guesses were just stupidity. Touching his forehead and comparing it with hers, the lady realized that her husband's body temperature was quite high. Waking up from this light touch, Ian opened his eyes slightly. His vision refused to focus. Therefore, he saw the girl only as a vague silhouette. Not fully believing his eyes, he named her Isabella. Then, in hope, he extended his hand to her. Repeating the name, the gentleman began to stammer and apologize to her. Tears rolled down his cheeks. Repeating his apologies, he insisted that he had made a mistake and should have allowed the girl to live the way she wanted. Afterwards, Ian muttered that it was all his fault, that because of his selfishness, the lady suffered. He paused before finishing his sentence. The reason was that Miss squeezed his hand with hers. Sitting down on a chair next to the bed, the young lady asked her husband to calm down. Then she said that she was not Isabella, only his wife. With slight sadness in his voice, he asked again. Without letting go of his fingers, Madeline confirmed that it was her. Then she added that she was his wife. Not fully understanding everything that was happening due to his illness, the brunette again asked her name. The girl wanted to repeat that she was his wife, but did not finish the sentence because the count squeezed her hand forcefully. Having come to his senses a little, the gentleman understood a little the whole situation. Smiling, he firmly repeated her name. Still holding each other's hands, the blonde looked at her husband in surprise, and he firmly repeated that she was his wife. A red rose stood alone in a small vase on the bedside table. Milady was crying for some reason. Tears quickly rolled down her cheeks. It was very loud. Shots and grenade explosions were heard. The whole earth was burning with fire and dead bodies were scattered all around. Someone shouted for everyone to move back. The standing man tried to shout to Lieutenant Nottingham. He reported that their fighters were seriously wounded. All the young man's clothes and helmet were stained with blood and dirt. One of his allies approached him with the news that the enemy was advancing. Loud shots, arrivals, and explosions of grenades continued again. The blood and remains of the soldiers scattered in different directions. The brunette watched all this in amazement. Screams were heard. Someone's leg was blown off. That knight started a sentence but never finished it. Others screamed that they did not want to die, and some asked the lieutenant to save them. The whistle of a combat shell was heard very close by. Someone warned the man about this, but it was too late. Sweat was running down my face. The count screamed and his pupils shrank from fear. He jumped in bed from everything he saw. Breathing heavily, the brunette slowly began to walk away. He had that nightmare again. Noticing that someone was still holding his hand, he turned his head and saw Madeline, who had fallen asleep while sitting. The wife snored peacefully with her head in her hands. Trying to remember what happened, the gentleman could not understand what she was doing in his bedroom. Ian silently examined the sleeping lady. He couldn't believe it was Miss who was courting him. He smiled peacefully, thinking that whatever the reason, he felt much better now. The blonde was dispelling the brunette's nightmares. and also pulled me out of memories of the war. Their marriage was concluded out of simple necessity, a flawed wife for a flawed count. So gloomy were the thoughts of a man standing at night and sadly looking out the window. He is a man broken by war, and she is a young, impossibly simple-minded noblewoman, completely unaware of the horrors of armed conflicts. Ian seemed to be watching her from a distance. At that moment, my lady was playing with her dog at sunset. They were complete opposites of each other. However, over time, everything has changed. One day, sitting in his office, the brunette turned to Sebastian, who was standing a little away. At the same time, looking at and sorting through some papers, he asked if perhaps with a dog the lady wouldn't be as lonely as she was now. At such moments, she was still able to find a way into his world, to his heart, and then she brought him into her world. Without taking his eyes off the sleeping blonde, the Earl of Nottingham asked himself whether he had the right to be with her. The man lost sleep. He thought that he had committed too many sins and was unworthy of his wife. After all, if something is knocking, then everything may turn out that Ian will one day drag her into his own hell. Finally waking up, Madeline looked with sleepy eyes at her husband. She was also slightly relieved to realize that Ian had come to his senses. Lowering his hand and a little embarrassed, the blonde looked away, and she told her husband that he had a terrible fever that night. Looking down, the brunette said that now everything was fine with him. Awkwardly turning away, the green-eyed gentleman briefly asked how Corey's dog was feeling. The lady mumbled that everything was fine with the animal. Abruptly changing the subject, he turned to Madeline. Nottingham remembered her words about how my lady wanted to go to the cinema. Trembling at this phrase, the girl turned her eyes to him and confirmed it. Without turning to face his wife, the Count assured that now his wife could leave the estate at any desire. He didn't want to keep her here any longer. Not expecting such a generous offer, Madeline rudely asked in response whether the gentleman expected gratitude from her. Shocked by such a rude answer, the Count said that he was just not worried about her, because the world was very dangerous. But from today, the wife could attend all the dinner parties and holidays she wanted. Without answering this, Madeline thought about what helped the brunette soften after so many years. First he saved her dog, and then he let the lady go to the cinema. It is not clear why. She suspected some kind of a trick and sharply asked if the world had suddenly become safe. His hand clenched the sheet from tension. Still continuing to look out the window, the brunette replied that he no longer wanted to drown his wife in his inferno. At first, after a slight pause, she stammered and clarified about his heat. The ardor cooled down a little, and so Madeline asked not to talk like that. The gentleman resisted. Sitting up completely and swinging his legs off the bed, he assured that keeping quiet would not change the fact that it was true. Taking his cane, which was clattering heavily from contact with the floor, he asked the young lady to call Sebastian to him on the way back. Lowering her eyes to the floor, Milady awkwardly called out to Ian. Something still haunted her. Stopping, the Count silently turned around and waited for the continuation. The blonde said that he could pick as many roses as he wanted, because it was his garden too. They made eye contact for a while. The couple looked at each other awkwardly. Without answering at first, the gentleman thought that maybe he had the right to hope that their relationship could result in something good. Arriving at sunset in his office, Madeline placed an elegant cup of tea on the Count's table. After this action, she asked how the gentleman was feeling now. The brunette was reading some papers with the moon. Without turning towards the lady, the Count calmly replied that he felt quite well. Briefly pleased by this, Madeline said nothing more. The blonde stood next to him for a while and noticed something. Ian smiled blissfully, and a blush appeared on his cheeks. Milady noticed that after that day, Ian seemed to become a little more polite towards her. Previously, he would hardly have even answered her question. Turning towards the bookshelves, something caught her attention. One of the books standing in a row really attracted her gaze. Madeline was amazed to see this writing here. Taking it in her hands with admiration, she asked whether this was the first edition of Tamerlane the Great. Noticing his wife's delight, the man said that she could take it to read if she wanted. Raising her eyebrows in surprise, the blonde asked if she could take this building to herself. Because Nottingham looked at her, she thought that she was too hasty when she said that he had become kinder. Scratching her head, she quickly corrected herself that she would only take it temporarily. After all, she knew that the book was not hers. But without finishing the sentence, the Count interrupted her, saying that he should consider the book his property. And then he continued to assure his wife that everything that was in this house was also hers. Her garden was also the master's garden, and his office was hers too. From such a confession, the mistress's cheeks turned red, and her heart began to beat loudly. Deciding not to continue this conversation further, the dark-haired gentleman switched to Sebastian. He asked how things were going with the repair of the estate fences and whether everything was fine. In addition, they needed to take care of at least minimal protection if war suddenly broke out. Therefore, he offered to take control of his hands. Holding the book with one hand and not taking her eyes off it, Miss thought about when her husband would stop thinking about wars. If only she could distract him for just a moment. Looking at the first edition of the old play, Madeline came to the idea that he liked such things. Suddenly a thought struck the girl. Her eyes lit up with joy and she pressed the book tightly to her chest. Standing alone in the large hall, the assistant complained that this whole film screening was started by a girl. Not only did they have nowhere to spend it, but there was still so much to do and prepare. Having listened to his phrase to the end, Madeline smiled and said that it would be possible to arrange it for a double chapel. Afterwards, she explained that this was Ian's first request, and she wanted everything to go just perfectly. And she hoped that the others would like it too. Already weakly trying to object to her, the elderly man suggested simply having a tea party, as everyone else did. But she fiercely assured Sebastian that this mansion was in desperate need of change. It might have been a bad idea, but she wanted to show the Count that the world was returning to normal. Smiling carefree, Madeline asked that since the war is becoming more and more a thing of the past every day, then isn't it time for them to slowly begin to change themselves? While arranging the flowers, the blonde said that everyone needed to change. And to this mansion, and to Ian, and then, more for herself. She quietly added that she herself too. The gray-haired man looked at the lady in amazement. His eyebrows rose in surprise after this monologue. Placing his hand on his chest and bowing, he apologized for not being able to understand the entire deep message that Madame so wanted to show. And he assured that in the future he would also try to support her. Smiling at this, the young lady briefly thanked her. Meanwhile, Sebastian was called out by one of the servants. Holding the head of some creature in his hands, he joyfully asked what he should do with this trophy. The man stammered and ordered to be left in his room. This was his hunting trophy. The brown-haired man assured that he would return him to his place immediately after dinner. From the dialogue, the blonde smiled tensely. Preparations were in full swing. On the top floor, the girl noticed her husband walking calmly. Anxious thoughts ran through her head. She wasn't sure that everything would be fine and really hoped so. Madeline held a beautiful scarlet rose in her hands, and so they began to prepare for the film screening. There was a lot to take care of, starting with decorating the chapel, and then finish with some treats. She was somewhat exhausted from all the commotion. Because of this preparation, a very lively atmosphere began to reign in the palace. People walked from side to side. Thanks to this, my lady was finally able to feel alive again. Watching her husband from afar, our heroine noticed that Ian himself had absolutely no reaction to all this action. But you could tell that he was trying to show his so-called respect and not interfere in their troubles. However, since Madeline definitely needed to dispel some doubts, she still came. Knocking on the beautiful dark carved door, she heard in response permission to come inside. The hinges creaked. The lady was quite tense from the upcoming conversation. Smiling, she asked if the man was still working. Holding the paper in his hands, the Count said that it was a kind of vacation. Not finding anything to answer, the blonde just hummed stupidly in response. Ian realized that his wife came to his office for a reason. The brunette looked at her questioningly, turning away awkwardly. Madeline insisted that she was just a little nervous. After all, this was the first time she had invited so many people to their house. She had her own fear that something could go wrong during the events. Of course, they sent out all the invitations, but they had not previously communicated much with the guests. In addition, this was the first event as countesses, so her biggest wish was that everything would go smoothly. The wife replied that she had already done a good job. Delighted by this compliment, the blonde's cheeks turned purple. She said that she was going to have a film screening after the tea party, and she asked if her husband had ever watched films. Having completely switched to his wife, he replied that it was only one time, at an exhibition in Paris. Touching him on the shoulder with one hand, either asking or ordering, Madeline said this time to be sure to watch the film with her. Turning her blue eyes to her husband, she assured him that he would be very interested. Not wanting to further distract him from work, she hesitantly told him to rest. Then she quickly headed towards the exit. The brunette's cheeks and ears were burning, and for some unknown reason my heart was pounding rapidly in my chest. "Walk out the door!" The embarrassed blonde covered her face with her hands. Inside, she was elated that she had finally told the man this, and the heart beat no slower than the Count's heart. The eyes were full of feelings. The hands continued to cover the burning cheeks. On the day of the show, the main hall was full of noise. Everyone around was drinking various drinks and talking cheerfully to each other. The Countess, in a pale blue dress and with a glass in her hand, was very happy that so many people came to the mansion for the show. They said that in their days there was no special division between nobles and commoners, but at the same time, the outfits were not all alike. The blonde thought that most likely most of them came just to gawk at that famous haunted mansion. Not noticing her husband among the guests, she thought that he was unlikely to show up. Well, she was more worried about the fact that he might not come to the screening of the film. Suddenly, her sad thoughts were interrupted by a voice from above. A male voice from the top floor apologized for arriving so late. A man's hand touched the railing. Heavy footsteps were heard. The brunette, leaning on his cane, slowly walked down the stairs. Having introduced himself to everyone present, he said that his name was Ian Nottingham, and he was the owner of this mansion. He continued to go down the stairs when people suddenly fell silent. Some began to whisper. The gentleman thanked them for honoring them with their visit that evening. Looking sideways, the Count continued his monologue. He hoped that they would all have a great time today. The blonde looked in amazement at her husband descending the stairs. This whole performance greatly alarmed her. Hobbling on his injured leg, the Count walked over and stood opposite Madeline. He apologized to her directly for being late. Those gathered looked at it all in amazement. Smiling at her husband, Madeline easily said that they were just about to start that very film screening. The brunette smiled back at his wife. Giving her his hand so that she could take it, he offered to go together in this case. Glancing at his hand again in shock, Milady froze in indecision. After briefly thinking about his proposal, she briefly said that if that was the case, then of course they could go together. Then she lightly took hold of it, but at that moment when she took it, she felt that the man's hand was trembling. Worried by this, she quickly asked if everything was okay, and she added that he shouldn't have overexerted himself. Looking at his wife, Ian replied that it was okay. He suggested that it was difficult for her to greet guests herself. They limped towards a special room. Madeline added quietly that she was still worried about him. Shaking his head, the brunette assured that he was fine. It's just that the man himself didn't mind watching the film. Holding their hands, they walked towards the hall. The blonde looked at her husband in admiration. Flushing, she clarified whether he wanted to say that he wanted to watch a movie with her. In response to this, the Count remained silent. But the answer was clear because his ears began to turn red. The old cassettes played the film with a slight crackle. The projector was reflected on the opposite wall. That evening, the film The General was shown. It was a silent action comedy by Buster Keaton, in the center of which a simple engineer becomes a hero of the United States Civil War. Sitting next to each other in the front seats, Ian asked his wife what kind of movie it was. Smiling in a whisper, she replied that she herself did not know what he was talking about. And she assured that many said that this was a new film by one of the most eminent film directors of our time. The lady thought people might like this. That's why I decided to watch it together. Thinking, Ian said that his wife did a pretty good job. He was clearly pleased. The girl's cheeks began to glow at her husband's compliment. But not finding anything to answer, Madeline remained silent. Muffled laughter was heard from different corners of the hall. Some even applauded. An obviously very funny moment was shown on the screen, since even the blonde, slightly covering her face with her hand, began to laugh. Having taken a break from watching an entertaining film for a while, the young lady looked at her husband. He sat here with his hands on his knees and clenched into fists. Just like the others, he smiled but did not laugh. She was also surprised by the fact that her husband watched this film so carefully and enthusiastically. Noticing her gaze too late, the Count shuddered. Now that Ian had arrived, the party could definitely be considered successfully completed. Staring at the floor and distracted from the movie, the lady thought that before her husband appeared, she thought that he would stay in his room. And so, we will have to thank him later. But suddenly, on one of the military scenes, the Count's hand trembled. The cane fell out and fell to the floor with a clatter. Not immediately noticing this, the blessed girl thought that in this way perhaps they would become a little closer to each other. Shots were heard on the screen. Suddenly, a roar was heard. The shaking Count fell onto the table in front of him. The blonde gasped in amazement. Sharply shouting his name, she began to shake his shoulders, but his body only groaned quietly and jumped from his place. Miss tried to stop it. Madeline tried to call someone who could help her. There was noise around the scene of the incident. Repeating his name again and again, the blonde cried out for help. With tears in her eyes, she begged. Holding her husband by the shoulders, she didn't know what she should do next. Suddenly, footsteps were heard. The blonde man asked the lady to calm down, after which he stated that he was a doctor. He said the Count's symptoms were more like a nervous attack, and therefore the man simply could use a good rest now. Having given an order to the people standing nearby, the blonde man with glasses ordered His Excellency to be quickly taken to the bedroom. Madeline didn't even have time to say anything. When the Count was already taken by the arms and led away to his chambers, the blonde asked to put a rag in the Count's mouth since he could bite his tongue. A young lady's quiet voice was heard from the man's side. She apologized and quietly clarified whether her savior was a doctor. Squinting his eyes at her and pushing his glasses higher, he confirmed. He claimed that he had a doctorate in neuropsychiatry and had also worked in a hospital for some time. Handing over his business card, the blonde said that his name was Cornell Arlington. At first, looking at the cardboard card, our heroine did not dare to pick it up. Madeline looked at a simple white business card with black lettering. At the same time, the man said that he was the eldest son of Baron Arlington. With tears of joy in her eyes that everything had turned out okay, the girl asked how everything could have coincided like that. After which she sincerely thanked the blonde. Madame Madeline was very happy that the doctor showed up so opportunely at the right moment. She didn't even suspect that she was welcoming death itself. Lying on the sofa in her room at night, the girl heard some commotion outside the window. Shots and flights were heard. Her gaze immediately tensed and turned towards the window. But the roar on the street did not stop. After this, the 28th of June 1914 came again. 2 shots rang out in Sarajevo. It was very loud. This was the beginning of the war. The man handed his wife some documents. Afterwards, he said that Miss could live in the townhouse until the end of this month. In the meantime, he was looking for a new home for the lady. Agreeing, the blonde said goodbye to him. A detachment of military men was walking along the street. The young lady looked in their direction in surprise. They were talking about something. Looking at the newspaper lying under her feet, the blonde saw that there was an announcement about the declaration of the beginning of hostilities. Great Britain declared war. Following Austria-Hungary as well as 2 empires, German and Russian. People were burning with patriotism, so almost every man went to fight at the front. Those who refused to fight were strictly branded cowards. But at the same time, people highly valued newly minted soldiers who were ready to defend their homeland. And in a past life, unfortunately, she behaved exactly the same as all those people. Moreover, she did not yet know how expensive blind patriotism can sometimes be. Sitting in a red chair in a townhouse, the blonde was reading a newspaper. The young lady thought that now everything was completely different. But she didn't have time to finish her thought. My father burst into the room with a bottle of alcohol in his hand. He screamed that Madeline was a damn toadstool. There was a loud bang from the door, which collided sharply with the wall. Looking contemptuously at her father, Madeline reproached him for getting drunk again. The man sharply shouted that he really got drunk, assuring that it was all because of his daughter. The man screamed that because of her there wasn't a penny left. That's why he had to choke on this cheap drink. He scolded his daughter because if she had agreed to marry the Count, none of this would have happened. Kneeling in front of her father, who dropped the bottle and its contents spilled onto the floor, Madeline asked her father to stop and come to his senses. She informed her drunken father that she had sold this house too. Therefore, they urgently need to look for new housing. The man froze in shock. The father refused to believe these words and asked again in rage. Reaching out her hand to him, Madeline repeated herself. She said that she had already told him about this. Therefore, she ordered me to stop constantly wooing her. But before she could finish her sentence, her father hit her on the hand. The documents fell into a puddle of alcohol. The blonde screamed loudly and furiously. He said it was good. They could have finished. The man shouted that the lady was used to doing everything as she pleased. He didn't need such a wayward daughter. Therefore, from that moment on, he was no longer her father. She was touched by such furious words, but she didn't show her emotions in any way. In the end, the blonde shouted that he would rather perish alone than with her. Coldly saying that everything was clear to her now, she stood up. But the gentleman could no longer be stopped. He shouted that if he had known everything in advance, He would have bought himself a shack with the money he invested in raising his daughter. And he blamed the fact that there was absolutely no benefit from that one. The thought flew through the blonde's head that the man who once called himself her father never loved his daughter. Closing her eyes, Madeline thought that sooner or later this would all end. Kneeling, the flushed man continued to insult Miss. Besides, now she had no chance of marriage. Miss's hand clenched into a fist. Both Nottingham sons have already volunteered. And since all decent men signed up and went to the front, the lady was doomed to die in poverty. Leaving her father screaming on the floor, Madeline headed for the exit. They don't say anything. She wondered if everything would really be exactly as it was originally intended. The screams from my father never stopped. But the young lady no longer cared about them. She was simply heading towards the door to leave this room. The lady was now occupied only with thoughts of Ian. And if this really was the end, then maybe it was worth telling him something. It was night outside and the weather was terrible. The rain was pouring down and the lightning was flashing brightly. In a previous life, when Madeline was 27 years old, the Count was tied to a chair and electrocuted. Opposite him stood the doctor. He was reading some documents. During the electric shocks, his lordship's entire body shook. There was a small gap in the door. There could be seen a train from a new dress of some noblewoman. The maid standing next to Madeline. She clarified whether it was really possible to treat people this way. In response, I heard that it was supposedly the newest medicine. Seeing how her husband was in pain, the blonde's eyes were full of sadness, and her hand clenched nervously. She wanted to believe that this would help her husband, so she decided to just trust. The man lay in a cold sweat. A woman's hand carefully wiped his face with a light napkin. Noticing that her husband opened his eyes and stood up, Madeline asked if she woke him up, after which she apologized. The brunette replied that it was nothing. Without answering this, the girl asked if it was hard for him. Then she looked worriedly at her husband. Returning to the pillows again, Ian asked if she had just talked about his treatment. Squinting his green eyes full of fatigue to the side, he assured his wife that he should get better soon. Besides, since he was no longer able to live like this, it was worth trying to recover. The blonde was delighted by such a cheerful mood. She, too, was full of hope for Ian's recovery. The doctor assured the lady that he was a member of the medical profession of the Kingdom of England, and everyone around him said that he was very talented. Therefore, the man was bound to feel better soon. And the Count himself mentioned that the doctor told him that having healed him, he would use this experience to save other people. Reaching out her hand again with a napkin clutched in her fingers, the girl wiped her face. Nottingham asked not to worry about him. Stammering, he tried to assure him that he would soon feel better. But he didn't finish the sentence he started. Milady sat and sadly looked at her husband. At that moment, a male voice behind her called out to her. Heavy footsteps were heard. The girl looked back. The blonde asked Madeline to come out for a minute. A doctor stood not far from Miss. As always, his face lacked any emotion. It was necessary to talk to the miss about her husband. The doctor said that as the lady knew, his lordship suffered from frequent attacks of concussion, which was also accompanied by an even greater shock. At the moment, they used a special treatment method that reduced susceptibility to such concussions. The blonde was sitting and drinking tea. The man asked if Madeline remembered what they talked about last time. The lady nodded her head positively. Former war heroes often suffered from this disease, and the Count was a prime example of this. Although research continues to this day, most of their patients were cured after a course of therapy. The girl listened with transfixation. Her hand trembled. Milady said that it was a great joy. She didn't know how to thank the doctor, but that was just his job. Worried about her husband's condition, Madeline asked if she could be useful to the guy. He assured that as a doctor he had to ask her for something. It turned out that the request was quite short. For a while, she just needed to stay away from her husband. The smile disappeared from the lady's face. Noticing this, the man explained that after exposure to the stimulus, the patients needed time to be alone. Her husband had to overcome this himself. Such news made Miss tense, but she couldn't find anything to answer. This kind of treatment was like cutting out a rotten wound. Therefore, there should be absolutely no hesitation. The young lady recalled the events of the recent evening, how she asked the gentleman to watch a movie with her. And then all those terrible events happened, how the man felt bad, and how shocked she was at that moment. It occurred to her that not only had they started this film screening, because of which Ian had suffered, but it turned out that the lady had also interfered with the treatment. The blonde weakly denied it, and he said that he considered this simply a doctor's recommendation, which would enhance the effect of treatment. When adjusting seizures, the most important thing is to keep your mind intact. So from now on, communication with the Count had to be carried out through a doctor. And in return, he will report on his husband's condition every week. Electric discharges flashed. The brunette's face twisted in pain. The man calmly took notes and advised the gentleman to be patient. Seeing how dear his wife was to him, the doctor argued that Ian had to endure it at least for her sake. Trying to make the gentleman feel guilty, he asked if he felt sorry for his wife. After all, she literally did more than was in her power to care for this crippled body. Turning his back to His Excellency, the doctor assured that he should become a worthy husband. Taking a syringe with some liquid in his hands, he said that first a man will have to learn to survive without relying on others. Due to the fact that the body was tied to a chair, the Count could not do anything. He just looked at the needle in fear. The blonde assured that only after this they could begin real treatment. A heart-rending scream was heard. In those days, psychiatric treatment was just that. Hearing the cry, the lady sat up in bed worriedly. Her dog Corey also looked worried with his ears down. Then the lady believed Arlington so much that she believed that even heart-rending cries of pain were a sign of an improvement in her husband's health. One day, having entered the Count's office, Madeline just stood at his side for some time. Since the brunette was writing something on paper, light scratching sounds were heard. Looking sadly at the gloomy man, she thought that the number of attacks had really decreased greatly. But Ian became even more rude and serious than before. The gentleman was writing something. Madeline called his name because she wanted to tell him something. And since the room was quite dark, she suggested opening the curtains and letting at least some light into the room. Besides, there was a beautiful warm sun shining outside the window. The Count angrily replied that there was no need to do this at all. Taking the papers in his hands and rereading them once again, he hinted that his wife should leave. Otherwise, she would only interfere with him. Continuing her pathetic attempts to return their contact, at a loss as to what happened to him, his wife asked him about his well-being. The man assured that he felt quite well, smiling tensely, upset by such dry answers. The young lady assured that she was glad to hear this. She again tried to start a conversation on the topic of a book she liked, but the irritated brunette closed his eyes angrily. Due to the fact that he was quite tired of these conversations, Ian, almost giving an order, asked his wife to leave his office. Madeline's eyes filled with tears at this harsh phrase. Memories of those words of the Count that everything was common here flew through my memory. Turning his tired green eyes to his wife, he hoped that from now on she would not pester him during working hours. Everything was as if all that invisible warmth that once flowed between them had turned into a dream. Madeline asked the doctor if her husband was definitely on the mend. In response to an angry look, she explained that she simply did not understand this issue well, and hoped that the man could explain it to her. The gentleman gave the surprised girl a book. He said that this work would help to understand the state of His Excellency. On the beautiful cover, it was written that the publication was about neuropsychology. Apparently, as the guy noted, she was very interested in this topic. Raising the cup to his mouth, the blonde said that, to be honest, he sincerely hoped that the lady would want to know more about this area. A light cup with a hot drink hit the saucer. The lady did not fully understand what the respected doctor was talking about. Explaining closer to the point and directly, the blonde assured that in his opinion, Miss would make an excellent nurse. The gentleman saw how devotedly she cared for her sick husband. In addition, she conscientiously followed all the recommendations of the attending physician. Simply put, the lady was very talented and the man would love to have her as his personal assistant. Having turned slightly pale from such a sharp and direct proposal, the miss asked again, being in a state of shock. But there was bad news. According to the doctor, it is unlikely that anything can help His Excellency. The blonde raised her eyebrows and shouted that she trusted him no matter what, and now she heard this. Judging by the grin, pleased with this reaction, the doctor said that he meant that the situation was not improving in the direction Madeline wanted. It was already getting dark outside. Miss was at a loss. She heard that the Count would no longer suffer from seizures because he had successfully completed the course of treatment. A question was asked. Isn't the lady tired of her husband? This offer was especially for her. He asked about going on a long journey with him and then learning to work as a nurse. Mr. Arlington believed that Madeline had a special gift, and he was surprised that she wanted to waste it in order to continue to remain the obedient wife of the shell-shocked Count. Milady could consider this a kind of revenge on the man who imprisoned her herself. The blonde assured that he would allow the lady to study wherever she wanted. Therefore, the man was waiting for the final answer whether Madeline would leave with him. The maid, who overheard part of the conversation, covered her mouth with her hand in horror, and she decided that she urgently had to do something. Evening fell like a gray veil over the castle. The clouds evoked a depressive mood and seemed to aggravate the situation in the palace. While cleaning the porch, the maids discussed how Dr. Arlington suggested that their mistress leave her husband and go on a trip with him. No one understood why the blonde allowed himself such insolence and was ready to betray the doctor's principles. This was followed by a logical question. The girls were interested in what the lady herself answered to this, how she escorted him out of the castle, closing the doors forever for that. However, there was much more to be surprised. The woman only remained silent in response without saying anything in response. The conversation immediately turned to the Countess. Before her marriage to his lordship, the girl was an ordinary noblewoman with huge debts, and if it weren't for her husband's illness, she would now live without knowing sadness in her still young years. However, circumstances forced her to sit within 4 walls. The girls started discussing when the couple first became close. After all, there were a lot of staff in the castle, but the offer to leave for study was only for their mistress. I immediately remembered how 2 years ago the blonde had already escaped from the castle, and the maids with evil tongues suggested that it was then that she met the Count's current doctor. Ian stood behind the wall. Naturally, he heard every word the girls said and understood what they were talking about. The hand clenched on the crutch, and the green eyes widened in horror, trying to catch on to one point. His whole body was shaking with rage. In the evening, the man lit a fireplace. The logs crunched pleasantly to the ear, and a pleasant heat came to the table. The Count reasoned aloud, looking at the glass of whiskey through the light from the living fire. He tried to understand whether Madeline was going to leave him at such a time. The man endured too much for the sake of their happiness, for her own sake. However, she was still missing something, judging by everything that his attending physician could give the girl. For the sake of warmth, their common happiness and life, Ian went through hell. Now, replaying every smile of his beloved in his head, he wondered how she could turn out to be so deceitful. Memories were spinning in my head. Lowering his forehead to his knees, the man tried to piece together the picture of what was happening. After he went in search of the dog and fell ill, despite any orders, his wife finally appeared on the threshold of his bedroom. The Count wondered why the woman came when he was weak and unconscious, and for what reason she returned and what she did with him. He suggested that perhaps Madeline wanted him dead. In order not to get her hands dirty with blood, she called a doctor who would help her slowly and painfully pull life out of her already exhausted body. This means that the film that she showed publicly was not a mistake, but a deliberate plan to worsen his condition many times more. The Count's eyes turned red. His beloved wife was waiting all the time for the time when she could live without the stigma and get rid of the ballast, her seriously ill husband. My heart beat faster. My hands were shaking and slightly blue. The panic attack returned again. There was a knock from behind. A familiar voice brought him to his senses. Madeline stood on the threshold and asked permission to enter. She walked closer and saw an empty glass of ice on the table. The girl asked whether his lordship could drink alcoholic beverages. As far as she remembered, Dr. Arlington had asked him as a patient to abstain from drinks. A familiar name worked like ignition of a mechanism. The voice was lifeless but filled with rage. "Are you talking about him again?" the husband asked a seemingly rhetorical question. The tone in the room immediately cooled by 10 degrees Celsius. Ian raised his head. He chuckled. His wife was such a fan of the doctor that she wanted to be one herself. The cheeks turned red. Madeline began to deny everything her husband said. She did not want to leave her beloved at all, but only wanted to help him. Second, 2, 3. The man abruptly stood up from the sofa. He walked around the room sputtering with rage. The Count believed that in his house no one could indicate where, what, and how should happen. Miss was scared. Such outbursts of anger could not only cause stress for the body, but also worsen the general condition, returning to the condition for which the man was treated so painfully and for a long time. The wife hastened to assure her husband that the sooner he finally recovered, the sooner Dr. Arlington would leave their castle. It was as if a living shadow appeared behind the back of the real Madeline. The ghost whispered that she would go after him, after the doctor. The real wife continued to quickly talk about how the psychologist really needed to leave, but he could not leave the patient. The shadow spoke again. This time about the fact that she did not have the strength to live with such a monster as Ian. The hallucination grew all over the wall with the fiery figure of a beloved woman, who called names and tormented her husband's soul. As if from another world, the real Madeline came closer to the brunette. She touched her cheek. She called him. A moment, and then there was silence. The Count pushed the girl's hand away from his face and took a step back. Quietly, he asked the blonde to go to his bedroom and leave him alone. In the room, it seemed that the water could instantly turn into icicles. In the same quiet voice, the Count said that since the girl was sold to him, she had to obey the owner like a bought dog. He leaned close to the very face of the once beloved and bright woman. He said that if it weren't for his connections, money and feelings, Madeline would have long ago lived on the street in a cardboard box. He argued that if the blonde heard her husband's words, she should have returned to her place and lived a quiet life in the castle, as befits the Count's wife. The brunette turned away with disgust, looking at the lady. The steps echoed behind her like a pendulum. The room was quiet and chilly. The fire had long gone out and only carried the smell of smoke into the corners. Madeline stood alone in the middle of the carpet, clinging to scraps of conversation with her husband. It rained all day. The clouds darkened the sky with a black sheet. The light did not get through them, so the street lamps worked all day long. The girl sat on the pouf silently, sadly looking at one point. The shadow fell on her fragile figure and made her skin even paler. The mascara was smeared from tears. Madeline didn't understand why her husband behaved like that with her, and why he was rude for no reason at all. Ian was sick. That much was obvious. However, the woman did not want to tolerate this attitude towards herself any longer. She no longer had the strength, and the only way out was to give up and move away. There was a knock. Dr. Arlington stood on the threshold. The man was wearing a white shirt and green tie. He held out a stack of papers about the Count's health this week. The first sheet was covered with tables and diagrams. The doctor said that the patient had already responded normally to the electric discharge, so all that remained was to maintain preventive treatment. The blonde thanked her for the report. However, she asked not to come personally to her bedroom, but to henceforth gather in the guest room. The man adjusted his glasses. He apologized because he had a lot to do and needed to hurry. When asked where the doctor was leaving and why so urgently, he replied that the Count ordered him to immediately leave his palace. Mr. Arlington asked if the girl had thought about his proposal, and he reminded that Mrs. was talented and could quickly learn medicine. The man continued to convince his interlocutor. He said that in the modern world it was no longer necessary to always be with your spouse. Madeline pushed the doctor away. She did not want to worsen the situation of her husband by leaving. Arlington smiled sadly. He asked if the naive girl really believed that she could achieve her former love. The blonde asked to think about how Ian behaved at the moment. He emphasized that he started drinking, which worsened his emotional state. Madeline turned red with anger. She did not want to listen to the bitter truth from the doctor who most likely told the real things about her husband's health. The blonde persistently repeated that the miss would have no other chance to escape from the castle. Judging by the fact that the man was in a hurry to kick the doctor out of the palace, it means that the husband suspected something. Madeline began to shake. The doctor surprisingly came up from behind and hugged her, and beggingly asked to go with him. Ian Nottingham whispered in his ear that the only thing Ian Nottingham did was put his wife in chains, creating the illusion of a happy family. The woman covered her face with her hands, giving vent to tears. Everything the doctor said was true. She nodded. I agreed. She also wanted to leave and forget everything that happened in this palace. A quiet voice from a dark corner called out to the couple. Madeline slowly raised her head. There was horror on his face. Furious, emerald eyes looked straight at his wife. She stood there, not understanding how to explain her conversation with the doctor. Step 2. The sound of the cane echoed in the empty room. Moonlight fell on his menacing figure. Madeline backed away. Ian laughed. Did his scars, power, and strength frighten his wife even more up close? Grabbing her hand, he hovered over her fragile body, and he asked menacingly why the doctor was better than himself. Tears flowed down my cheeks. The doctor's words were spinning in my head. Ian did nothing to make them happy except put her in chains. Madeline tried to break free from the tight grip. As soon as she endured all this horror for many years, the girl rolled down the steps and at the end hit her head on the tiles. The blood spread in a burgundy puddle like a halo around her snow-white hair. Present tense. Ian was sitting on the sofa in front of the table. My brother was sitting opposite. The conversation was interrupted by the younger sister. A carriage carrying Madeline Roanfield arrived at the palace. This is not an ordinary noblewoman who has arrived. This was the girl who refused the Count's marriage proposal a few hours ago before this event. The family opened the doors to one of the rooms and 3 people stood with their mouths open, shocked by what they saw. Mother stood in tears. The children attacked her with questions about how their father felt. The woman replied that the coming night was decisive for her husband. The younger brother decided to postpone his departure to the front for family reasons. The sister was already crying, hiding her face in her hands. If the father passes away, only he and his mother will remain. Mom supported her daughter. She asked Ian if he really wanted to go to war, since only the eldest son of the family was obliged to go. Isabel was nervous. She did not see anything heroic in dying on the front line, but only selfishness towards her family. The brunette got angry. Because of the situation with his father, he was transferred to the rear, and he was angry that this had hit his reputation hard. The sister saw her merit in the fact that both brothers were alive and in warmth and prosperity. The mother stopped the children from arguing. She reproached them that their father heard everything and understood what problems he brought to his close relatives. The elder brother asked to be released to his chambers. Mom nodded and invited all the children to go and rest. The guy, walking along the corridor, thought about the imminent end of his father and what the family would have to do after that. After the funeral, it was necessary to go to the front. The call was unavoidable, so it was necessary to withstand all the blows steadfastly. Isabel was to look after the castle while he and his brother were away. That girl burst into Ian's thoughts. Not like all the other noblewomen, even though at first glance she seemed like one. His gaze was drawn to her because of her radiant smile and her special attitude towards him. Usually all the girls ran in front of the Count, trying to make the right impression. Unlike Madeline, she was real, open and honest with everyone. Because of this, Ian wanted to sincerely help the girl and her family. Whatever happened, now it has lost its weight in the life of a soldier. There were much bigger problems on his shoulders now. The rain continued to fall. The blonde stood alone in the gazebo, which did not at all shelter the mist from the wind and icy drops of rain. The Count came up behind him. His shirt was stuck to his body and water was dripping from his hair. In his chilled hands he held a lantern with a warm light that illuminated the small island of their shelter. Ian asked the girl to return to his place. However, she stood in front of the man despite his request. He asked why she disobeyed the appeal. The blonde wanted to ask a question, apparently so important that she had the courage to come to the family on such an evening. Naturally, she understood the risk of her appearance in the castle, and also all the risks of their connection. The brunette snorted. The same words were spoken to him when they refused the engagement. Madeline shook her head. She heard that the man was going to war. Either tears were flowing down her cheeks or it was rain, but the girl stammered and asked whether the Count had to go to the hottest spots. He leaned closer to the girl's face, and he said that any of his actions should not have worried the young miss. Madeline was not far behind. She warned that the young man could lose absolutely everything he had now because of the war. The blonde took Ian's hot palm with her cold fingers, and she begged me not to leave. She came closer and almost buried her face in the guy's chest. The blonde repeated like a mantra so that the brunette would not go to war. Her shoulders shook from the weather and fear. True fear for a friend. Even though the girl hated him, she still did not want to let the Count go to war, as if she knew something in advance. With her hand on her heart, she confessed her sincerity. Madeline was about to get on her knees and not let go of the man until he agreed to stay home. The nodules appeared on the young man's cheekbones. Even though he chose a lady as his wife, she still had no right to tell him what to do. The Count admitted that he was ready to lose everything because of the war. He was not afraid of upcoming events and was not at all on the safe side. The blonde's hand reached out to the boy's cheek. The Count grabbed her wrist. The girl should have calmed down and not become nervous again because of him. On that note, Ian wanted to end their seemingly pointless conversation. Madeline shouted after him, asking why the Count proposed to her. Why did he want to see her as his wife if he was now going to certain death? Since the guy himself admitted that there was no love between them, then what was the benefit of the brunette's plan? Madeline agreed to marry her enemy. In return, he should not have gone to war at any cost. The emerald eyes seemed to glow. The brain was actively digesting the bold words of the uninvited guest. The young man squeezed the handle of the lantern. This crossed all boundaries. No one had the right to impose conditions on him. The first time he was rejected was because the girl wanted to find love, so she came now and kept him by blackmailing him. Miss clenched her fingers convulsively. I was afraid to come closer, say a few more words, turn to Ian and tell the truth. After standing for another minute in the pouring rain, the brunette shook his head and turned around. He was tired of these games with the girl. Madeline stood in the gazebo. Pictures from a past life popped up before my eyes where the guy suffered, writhed in pain and could not eat on his own. The decision to come straight to the castle, hoping that the young man would listen to her, was stupid. The fists clenched on their own. She might regret it, but she couldn't leave a man's life to the mercy of fate. One moment and the woman had already grabbed Ian's hand. She pulled with all the strength she had in herself. Tears rolled down her cheeks in large, crystal-clear hailstones. The girl's fragile body pressed against the guy's hand. Lady Rowanfield begged the Earl not to leave. She cried, squeezed the young man's forearm and begged. Ian's heart melted. He took the noblewoman by the hand. He smiled and said that from the very beginning of their communication, he realized how special the girl was. How different she was from the others. I felt everything too emotionally and truly sincerely. The hand slipped out of the tenacious grip of the thin fingers. The Count was indeed stubborn, and believed that this was not the kind of husband Madeline deserved. As soon as the silhouette disappeared into the shadows of the castle, the blonde sat down directly on the wet grass. The girl was never able to change the future of the person she once loved and previously hated. There was only one question in my head. Would she have had another chance? How many opportunities had already been missed? And why everything was slipping away right under her nose? Day. Madeline leafed through the magazine and paused on the article Work for Women. She ran her finger along the lines, reading the information in the ad. The blonde sighed. It was hard for her to choose an activity she liked, which could become her life's work. Her gaze fell on the column in the lower right corner. It was about the dead soldiers during the last week of hostilities. Frowning, the miss began to look through each name, surname, family, and origin of the fallen warrior. After a minute, she breathed a sigh of relief. A familiar name and brother Ian was not on that list. Tapping her finger on the newspaper, Madeline thought that perhaps she should not have invited Dr. Arlington to treat the Count. No matter what words the doctor praised his technique, it was after it that everything worsened many times more. The girl wondered if she met Mr. Arlington again, whether she could pretend that the couple did not know each other. The maid's voice came from behind. A letter arrived addressed to Madeline. The girl turned her head towards the door so sharply that her neck cracked. Miss approached the threshold where the letter flew. Our heroine wondered who could know where she now lived. Moreover, know the specific hotel room. The author of the letter wrote that she did not know whether the correct address was indicated on the envelope, but she still hoped that her message would still reach the girl. Once upon a time, the ladies knew each other, and they said that while they were alive, there was a chance to find a way out. Therefore, with the beginning of the war, the girl began to think about what should be done for their safety. Miss was going to create a hospital for disabled veterans from Nottingham Castle. Although her mother was against this idea, the volunteer could not be stopped. Madeline soon reached a familiar building. Enrollment was just underway for training in nursing and caring for the country's wounded heroes. Isabel was willing to give the blonde her own room and 3 meals a day from the family's cooks. The blonde arrived at the Nottingham estate in a wonderful mood. She stopped in front of the main entrance, holding a small suitcase with personal belongings in her hands. Isabel, Ian's sister, came out to meet her. The brunette was glad to see an old friend as a new addition to the ranks of volunteer nurses. She was the author of the letter that Madeline received 3 days ago. With this event, a new stage began in the life of our heroine.